For 3 generations, my family had owned this ranch. The land was never part of any HOA, and our property records prove it. But one summer morning, an unfamiliar SUV stopped outside my ranch gate. I had no idea that one woman inside was about to challenge everything my family had built. Margaret Whitmore introduced herself as the president of the nearby Homeowners Association. Then she pointed directly at my ranch and told me I had to leave the property. I stared at her, wondering if she had mistaken my gate for someone else's. Then I noticed the 2 sheriff's deputies standing behind her. "You're telling me I have to leave my family's ranch?" I asked. Margaret tightened her grip on the clipboard. "The HOA has jurisdiction over this area." I looked toward the deputies, then back at her. "Then show me the document that says this ranch belongs to your HOA." I opened the folder I kept in my truck and pulled out the original property documents. The deed traced ownership of the ranch back to my grandfather and great-grandfather. Margaret barely glanced at the papers before dismissing them as irrelevant. That was the first moment I realized she had no idea who she was dealing with. Margaret claimed the ranch was surrounded by a new residential development. According to her, the HOA believed the ranch fell within its planned community boundaries. She said I had ignored multiple notices and now faced an eviction process. I almost laughed, because not one of those notices had ever reached my mailbox. I studied the map Margaret had brought with her. There was something strange about the boundary line she was showing me. It appeared to cut directly across land my family had owned for decades. I asked her where the HOA had obtained that survey. Margaret hesitated before saying the HOA's development company had provided the survey. That answer immediately raised another question. Why would a private development company be responsible for determining my family's property boundaries? I decided it was time to stop arguing and start examining the records. I pulled up the county's public land records and compared them with Margaret's map. The discrepancy was obvious once I saw the original survey references. The HOA's boundary appeared to overlap property that was never included in its development, and that was when I noticed a much bigger problem. The original county records showed the ranch had a completely separate legal description, but the newer HOA documents seemed to rely on a boundary that didn't match those records. I had seen discrepancies like this before in my professional work. What Margaret didn't know was that reviewing land records was part of my actual job. I finally introduced myself properly and explained what I did for a living. I wasn't just a ranch owner standing in front of her gate. I was a Federal Land Auditor who had spent years reviewing complicated property records. Margaret's expression changed instantly, and suddenly nobody seemed eager to talk about eviction anymore. Margaret stared at my identification as if she expected it to disappear. One of the deputies stepped closer and asked if I was conducting an official review. I explained that my work involved examining federal land records and boundary disputes. The entire conversation suddenly became much more serious. I told them my professional background didn't automatically settle the ownership question, but it did mean I knew exactly which records needed to be checked. Margaret insisted her HOA had already completed its own investigation. I asked her to show me the complete chain of title supporting that claim. Margaret flipped through her paperwork, searching for the document she claimed existed. Her confidence seemed to disappear with every page she turned. Finally, she admitted the HOA didn't have the original property records with them. Instead, they had relied on a developer's boundary map. I looked closely at the developer's map and immediately noticed the problem. The map treated an old ranch access road as if it were part of the HOA's private property. But the county records showed that road had been part of our ranch easement for decades. That single mistake could explain the entire dispute. I walked the deputies toward the old boundary marker my grandfather had installed decades ago. The marker stood exactly where the original survey placed it. Margaret followed behind us, growing increasingly frustrated. For the first time, she seemed to realize that her paperwork might not tell the whole story. The old marker contained a survey reference number that matched the original county records. I photographed it and compared the number with the documents in my folder. Everything lined up perfectly with my family's property description. The HOA's map was the only thing that didn't. I showed the deputies the matching survey references and explained what they meant. The evidence wasn't complicated once the correct records were placed side by side. Margaret argued that the HOA still had authority over the land. I calmly asked her to identify the exact recorded document granting that authority. Margaret raised her voice and insisted the HOA had the right to enforce its rules. I reminded her that rules could not replace actual property records. One deputy politely asked everyone to lower their voices. Then Margaret made a statement that changed the entire situation. Margaret admitted the HOA had been trying to bring the ranch under its control for months. She said the development company believed the land was essential to expanding the neighborhood. That explained why they had suddenly appeared at my gate with eviction paperwork. This was no longer just a paperwork mistake. It was a much bigger dispute. I told Margaret that if the HOA truly believed it owned part of my family's ranch, we could settle the matter through the proper legal channels. But she would not be forcing me off my property that morning. The deputies agreed there was no basis for removing me from the ranch based on the documents presented. Margaret left angry, but I knew the fight was only beginning. Margaret stormed back toward her SUV, clearly furious about how the confrontation had ended. I watched her leave without saying another word. The deputies remained behind for a few minutes to document what had happened. I knew the HOA wouldn't simply walk away after that setback. That evening, I went through every document my family had preserved over the decades. I compared the original deeds with county survey records and historical maps. The more I researched, the more unusual the HOA's claim became. Then I discovered a document that had been overlooked for years. Buried inside my grandfather's old records was an original survey reference from decades earlier. It showed the ranch boundary had been established long before surrounding development existed. More importantly, the document identified a protected access corridor running beside our property. The HOA's proposed expansion appeared to cross that corridor. I mapped the original boundary against the HOA's proposed development plans. The overlap wasn't small. It affected a significant section of the ranch's western access route. If the records were accurate, the HOA had been planning around land it didn't control. I decided the next step was to request the official records directly. The next morning, I drove into town to review the official county records. I wasn't looking for a confrontation. I wanted facts. The clerk helped me locate the original surveys, easements, and historical boundary filings. What I found there confirmed my suspicions. The original county survey placed my ranch boundary exactly where my family records had shown it. The access corridor was also clearly documented in the historical filings. There was no recorded transfer putting that land under the HOA. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Then I found the key record, a certified filing showing the ranch's historical boundary had never been transferred. The HOA's paperwork simply didn't match the county's official records. I requested copies of everything relevant and carefully organized them. Now I had something much stronger than an argument at a ranch gate. I returned to my truck with copies of the official records in hand. The situation was no longer just a disagreement between a ranch owner and an HOA president. There was now a documented conflict between private development plans and historical property records, and I knew exactly how to escalate the matter properly. That night, I prepared a formal request for a review of the disputed land boundaries. I included the historical surveys, certified county records, and the HOA's conflicting map. I didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I simply asked the appropriate authorities to determine which records were legally valid. 2 days later, official investigators arrived at the ranch to review the disputed boundary. I stood at the gate, ready to provide every document they requested. Then Margaret appeared unexpectedly, clearly surprised to see them there. She had no idea that the paperwork she brought to my ranch had triggered a much larger review. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another HOA story. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We'd love to hear from you.